Lee Van Cleef was born Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey. He was one of the top 5 actors that people hated the most. He came from a working-class Dutch family as a boy. Little evidence of the cinematic legacy he would eventually leave behind came from his early life. He served with valor in the United States after completing high school, Navy in World War II, taking part in Pacific Theater missions on a minesweeper. His time in the military gave him a disciplined demeanor that he later effectively conveyed on screen. Van Cleef went home after the war and worked in a variety of civilian occupations, such as painting and accounting. But when he was chosen for a local production and Hollywood scouts noticed his powerful stage presence, his career took a dramatic change. In 1952, he made his cinematic debut in High Noon, portraying a mute, evil gunslinger. Despite having a little part and no dialogue, his remarkable appearance made an impression. Despite not looking like the typical Hollywood star, Van Cleef's high cheekbones, hawk-like nose, and fierce gaze were his best assets. He frequently appeared as a supporting antagonist in numerous criminal dramas and westerns during the 1950s and early 1960s. Even though he was rarely given prime billing at this time, his performances were always remarkable, and his characters were usually henchmen, outlaws, or cold-blooded killers. His ability to control the screen, even with little language, was demonstrated in movies like The Big Combo, 1955, Kansas City Confidential, 1952, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962. His acting career briefly appeared to be ended when a near-fatal vehicle accident in 1958 left him with a crippled knee. Van Cleef, however, had a remarkable second act in the 1960s that would turn him into a movie legend. For a few more dollars, he was cast opposite Clint Eastwood in the now iconic spaghetti western in 1965 by Italian filmmaker Sergio Leone. Van Cleef portrayed a steely, elegant bounty hunter out for vengeance, Colonel Douglas Mortimer. Both critics and viewers were astounded by his performance, which displayed a depth and magnetism that had mostly been unrealized in his previous parts. His ascent to prominence as a leading man began with this, which is uncommon for performers who had traditionally been cast in antagonistic roles. In The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, he and Eastwood reenacted their on-screen relationship as Angel Eyes, the ruthless, cunning villain in Leon's famous triad. The movie was a huge hit and guaranteed Van Cleef's global fame. Van Cleef enthusiastically embraced the spaghetti western genre, in contrast to many other actors who might have faded with the declining popularity of westerns. Going on to play the lead in several westerns in Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. Sabata, 1969, Death Rides a Horse, 1967, The Big Gun Down, 1966, and Day of Anger, 1967, were among them. His reputation as a master of moral ambiguity and stoic intensity was further solidified by each job. His quiet authority characterized his on-screen demeanor. Although he spoke quietly, there was always a sense of threat in his voice. Van Cleef's characters, even if they followed ethically dubious ways, were frequently intelligent, cunning, and motivated by personal codes of justice, in contrast to other Western stars who relied on bold heroism. He came to represent the anti-hero figure that characterized the contemporary Western. He was admired by the audience not only for his acting, but also for the way he appeared to inhabit his parts with a calm realism that was influenced by his own experiences and hardships. Van Cleef broadened his horizons in the 1980s by landing parts in action-adventure movies and television shows. He was the protagonist in the NBC series The Master in 1984 and played the autocratic police commissioner Hawk in the cult film Escape from New York in 1981. Where he portrayed a retired master of ninja. Even if the success of these latter endeavors varied, they demonstrated his capacity to adapt to shifting entertainment business trends. A number of noteworthy relationships characterized Lee Van Cleef's personal life, each of which developed at different points in his career in Hollywood and beyond. In 1943, he married Patsy Ruth Cale for the first time, a relationship that started in the tumultuous years of World War II. Van Cleef was only starting his acting career at the time, having just left the U.S. Navy to pursue a career in theater and movies. He was supported by Patsy Ruth, who became his constant companion during these early years as he started to establish himself in the field. They welcomed 3 children and raised a family together. They welcomed a son and 2 daughters into their life. Van Cleef was under a lot of pressure from his parenthood duties and his thriving acting career, and he frequently had to choose between his young family's needs and the demands of movie sets. The challenges that come with living in the spotlight eventually caused the couple's relationship to become strained, despite their shared past and the years they spent together. His first and longest-lasting marriage ended in 1958 when Lee and Patsy got divorced after 15 years of marriage. Van Cleef remarried in 1960, 2 years later, to Joan Marjorie Drang. He was going through a transition in his acting career when Joan entered his life. In Hollywood, he had seen both highs and lows, and was still recuperating from a severe vehicle accident that almost ended his career in movies in the late 1950s. As he attempted to re-establish himself in the industry, Joan offered him friendship and emotional support. During their 14-year marriage, Van Cleef had a significant career comeback, especially in Europe, where he became well-known worldwide for his roles in spaghetti westerns like For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He became famous in a way he had never experienced before, and Joan was there to support him. However, this union would also end in divorce in 1974, just like his first marriage. Although the exact causes of their split are still mostly unknown, it is certain that the constant demands of celebrity, frequent travel, and the demanding nature of life in the entertainment business were factors. Lee Van Cleef married Barbara Havalone in 1976, marking his third and last marriage. By this time, Van Cleef had solidified his reputation as a worldwide celebrity, especially in Europe, where his charismatic on-screen persona and distinctive looks made him a memorable and frequently menacing character in Western films. In addition to being his spouse, Barbara provided him with stability and consistency in the latter years of his life and profession. She was there for him during his latter years of filming and helped him deal with a number of health problems, such as long-term problems brought on by his previous auto accident and lifelong smoking habit. Barbara became the widow of a man whose legacy endures through his iconic performances after their marriage lasted till his death in 1989. Her ongoing attempts to commemorate his memory after his death demonstrated her commitment and loyalty. As the person who supported Van Cleef at the end of an incredible life and career, she is also frequently recalled with affection by fans. One of Hollywood's most memorable tough guys is Lee Van Cleef, the steely-eyed gunslinger with the unmistakable presence. He collaborated with some of the biggest names in film, but not all of those relationships were cordial. Van Cleef, who was well known for his direct demeanor and unflappable professionalism, didn't take egos or idiots lightly. He allegedly had arguments behind the scenes with a number of other performers over personality issues, creative differences, or outright contempt. Lee Van Cleef is claimed to have hated the following 6 actors the most. To put it mildly, Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne had a complex relationship. Although both were imposing symbols of the Western genre, there were significant variations in personality, politics, and professional respect that were hidden beneath their shared cinematic aesthetic. The all-American, flag-waving, studio-supported cowboy ideal was embodied by Wayne, while Van Cleef established his reputation with gritty, European-produced spaghetti westerns that celebrated moral ambiguity and cinematic realism. Van Cleef constructed his career from the ground up, beginning with little parts as villains and uncredited roles. He was a craftsman. He was angry at Wayne's conceited dominance of the genre, supported by influential people like John Ford. Crew members on adjacent studio lots reported that Van Cleef thought Wayne was arrogant and contemptuous, particularly when it was revealed that the Duke called European westerns cheap cowboy movies. That was perceived as a personal slight by Van Cleef, whose career skyrocketed in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There were rumors that Van Cleef declined a small part in a John Wayne-directed movie because he didn't want to be a studio puppet, even though they never co-starred. He avoided interacting with Wayne on the red carpet or during press tours, instead referring to him as Hollywood's mascot in private. Although it was never publicly acknowledged, Western insiders were aware of the competition. The Battle of the Brooding Alphas, Charles Bronson, number 2. Both Lee Van Cleef and Charles Bronson were regarded as having comparable tough, direct, and intense on-screen personas that could carry a movie with just one frown. But according to reports, Van Cleef resented the frequent parallels and had a secret grudge against Bronson, especially during the 1970s when both were at the pinnacle of their European renown. The pivotal moment might have occurred when Bronson was cast in the lead part of Van Cleef's stated interest in Sergio Leone's epic Once Upon a Time in the West. Leone selected Bronson for the lead, despite his prior preference for Van Cleef. This was purportedly interpreted by Van Cleef as a professional betrayal, leading him to doubt Leone's allegiance. Van Cleef made subtle fun of Bronson's wooden acting in subsequent interviews, once joking that a block of granite could display more emotion. Tension was reportedly so high on set that producers purposefully spaced out the shooting dates when the two briefly crossed paths during overlapping productions in Spain. Van Cleef, who was trained in theater and method acting, found it offensive that Bronson's quick ascent was seen by Hollywood as a reward for style rather than content, even though both actors were stoic professionals. 3. Eastwood, Clint. From a protege to an outcast. The person who helped make Lee Van Cleef famous throughout the world, Clint Eastwood, is arguably the most unexpected person on our list. They were renowned for their collaboration on For a Few Dollars, more in the good, the bad, and the ugly. However, their relationship was much more tense behind the scenes than it seemed on TV. Van Cleef first appreciated Eastwood's ambition and composed manner, but he felt abandoned as Eastwood's stardom skyrocketed in the 1970s. He felt that Eastwood had turned his back on the actors and directors who had helped him advance after using their partnerships as a springboard. The distance was further increased by Eastwood's move from actor to director, particularly when he didn't cast Van Cleef in later westerns that Van Cleef believed were suited for him, such as Pale Rider and High Plains Drifter. According to rumors, Van Cleef even inquired about possible partnerships with Eastwood's production business in the early 1980s, but was courteously turned down. Van Cleef was tactful yet tough in interviews. He once remarked, "Clint's gone Hollywood. He has exchanged grit and dust for cameras and alcoholic beverages." Industry insiders verified the hostility between the two titans was genuine, despite Eastwood's never publicly responding. Telly Savalas, number 4. In the 1970s, Van Cleef met Telly Savalas, who was most known for playing Kojak, a stoic gunslinger and an eccentric showman, when both were commonly seen in European action and crime movies. Savalas is said to have annoyed Van Cleef with his flashy demeanor and egocentric approach to celebrity. While Savalas loved the spotlight and frequently dominated sets with his charisma and erratic behavior, Van Cleef was a no-nonsense professional who valued discipline and nuance. Van Cleef allegedly left nearby sets during a brief, overlapping shooting in Italy after hearing Savalas call his acting approach stone-faced squinting. They were just water and oil in terms of personality. Van Cleef represented a subdued danger, while Savalas was the noisy, cigar-chomping scene stealer. There were persistent rumors that Van Cleef cited creative incompatibility as the reason for declining any future proposals that would match them. "I can't tolerate that guy," he said diplomatically. 5. The cowboy hat-wearing ego, Yul Brynner. Van Cleef also detested Yul Brynner, who was well known for the Magnificent Seven. Despite the fact that both performers had Western roots, Van Cleef thought Brynner was overly dramatic and overly preoccupied with maintaining his well-manicured image. They differed in philosophy and aesthetics. Van Cleef was intense, grounded, and raw, whereas Brynner was polished, smooth, and frequently distant. Despite their friendly public encounters at various European film festivals and award events, Van Cleef apparently thought Brynner was haughty and contemptuous. Brynner reportedly declined a co-starring role with Van Cleef because he didn't want to appear on screen with a second-string gunslinger, according to a well-known behind-the-scenes tale. Van Cleef frequently used Brynner as an example of Hollywood snobbery and never apologized for the remark. Van Cleef famously left Brynner off of a list of performers he admired, which included Franco Nero, Henry Fonda, and even Charles Bronson, when he was asked about them in a 1985 European interview. That omission was really telling. 6. A Clash of Cool, by James Coburn. Van Cleef's anger may seem improbable given James Coburn's reputation for easy coolness and silky charisma. However, the friction apparently originated from Coburn's nonchalant attitude toward acting and his tendency to dominate others with laid-back charisma. Coburn had coasted into celebrity on charm rather than skill, according to Van Cleef, who had to fight tooth and nail for recognition in Hollywood. Both performers were reportedly considered for the same lead role in a European Western, which was a particularly bitter experience. Van Cleef accused the filmmakers of prioritizing swagger above content once Coburn was cast in the role. Van Cleef's resentment increased when he overheard Coburn remark in an interview that it constantly seemed like someone had stolen his horse. Van Cleef, ever the solemn, arrogant craftsman, took the remark as an insult, even though it was probably meant in joke. Van Cleef reportedly cautioned younger actors against modeling themselves after Coburn unless they wanted to sleepwalk through their careers, even though they were never explicitly unfriendly in public. Despite being an absolute professional on set, Lee Van Cleef harbored resentment towards some of the biggest names in Hollywood because of his strong sense of creative integrity and his contempt for conceit, favoritism, and studio politics. Van Cleef's list of Hollywood enemies shows a strong dedication to the profession and a refusal to play the celebrity game, regardless of whether they were ideological rivals with John Wayne, personal betrayals from Clint Eastwood, or personality conflicts with Savalas and Brenner. These rivalries contribute to the mystique of the man who was, above all, the bad, and proudly so, in the dusty corners of film history. Van Cleef continued to work in movies until his death on December 16, 1989, even though he had heart illness in the 1970s and a pacemaker inserted in the 1980s. He passed away in his Oxnard, California, home after suffering a heart attack. One of the reported secondary causes of death was throat cancer.